Welcome and thank you for joining me for Tax Break. This is a podcast about South African tax for South African tax professionals and practitioners. My name is Pieter van der Schwan, and in each episode I share my thoughts with you on a topic or a recent development in South African tax. And I try to keep the episodes short enough that you can listen to them whenever you've got a quick gap in your calendar. Now, today we're talking about dividends tax on debit loans in companies. So those of you who have been listening to the podcast for a while would remember that earlier I had an episode about various considerations that you have to take into account when companies lend money to their shareholders. Today's focus is slightly different, and it's more on the practicalities that when a company has now made a loan to a shareholder, the loan arises from the fact that the person is a shareholder and it doesn't pay interest. What do you need to take into account from a practical perspective? Now, I think the first practical aspect that you need to consider is the rate that's involved here. So if there's a loan to a shareholder and that loan does not pay interest or bears interest at less than the official rate, then a deemed dividend arises. And this deemed dividend that arises is the difference between the interest that would have accrued on the loan had it borne interest at the official rate, and the interest that was actually charged in the case of an interest-free loan, probably zero. So the difference between those two things, that's your deemed dividend. Now, as you can then see, the concept of the official rate is central to all of this. Now, the official rate is a term that's defined in the Income Tax Act in the case of a rand-denominated debt, as a lot of these shareholder loans would be. It's the repurchase rate plus 100 basis points. So basically the repo rate plus 1%. Now, as you know, the repo rate changes from time to time. There was a change not so long ago. And when a new rate is announced by the Reserve Bank, that new rate becomes the official rate from the month after the month in which it was announced. So in other words, if there was a rate change announced in May, then for June, the new rate is the official rate for tax purposes. The second practical aspect that I would like to remind you about is the when. So we've spoken about the rate, how to do the calculation, the timing and when this happens. So what the legislation determines is that this deemed dividend is deemed to be paid by the company on the last day of the year of assessment. So for a lot of the smaller companies, especially the ones where the shareholders draw amounts throughout the year, and that's how the debit loan accrues. If you've got a February year end, which a lot of them has, then the dividend is deemed to be paid on the 28th of February, and this means that you have to submit your dividends tax return and pay the tax by the end of March. Now, this is the exact reason why I've actually decided to have this episode at this point in time. In a few discussions with some accountants, I've realized that taxpayers and their accountants from time to time actually forget about this tax. So unlike something like provisional tax or the normal tax season or EMP 501 filings, this isn't as obviously part of the normal tax cycle as those things. So taxpayers and the accountants tend to forget about it. So just make a note, if your firm doesn't have a process for this, maybe implement something for this to at the end of every year of assessment check whether there's a debit loan or not. The next thing is the nature of the deemed dividend and who actually bears the cost. So the dividend is deemed to be a dividend in specie. So what that means is that it's not the shareholder to whom the loan has been granted, but the company that's responsible or liable for the tax. And if the company is liable for the tax, it means that all the shareholders in that company essentially bear a part of the cost of this tax. So I have on a few occasions seen that when the other shareholders in a company realize that one person has been making drawings, there's a tax on these drawings, and they all bear the cost of this tax. They are not too happy about it most of the time. So just something to bear in mind. It's not a cost that you can just directly pass on to that shareholder. The last thing I would like to point out, and it came out in one of my recent consultations, although I think it's a very rare, it should becoming more rarer and rarer, is that if you've got an old loan, so in other words, a loan that arose before dividends tax came into effect, and that loan was subject to STC, the loan isn't subject to the deemed dividends tax rules under the dividends tax system. So what that practically then means is that you need to separate that loan into its parts. The portion that arose before dividends tax came into effect, and the portion that arose afterwards. And there would be some practical questions there as to if there's been a repayment, where do you allocate it? Do you allocate it to the oldest debt first? So in other words, the portion that was subject to STC, or do you allocate it to the newer part? So some practical questions to think about. Right, so to summarize and conclude for today's episode, a few practical things we spoke about that you need to keep in mind. The rate, the date when this tax needs to be paid, who practically bears the cost of the tax, and that you may have to, in some cases, split the loans into an old portion, a pre-dividends tax portion, and a post-dividends tax portion. That's it for today's episode. If you've got any comments, feedback, ideas for future episodes, please send me an email. My email address is in the show notes. If you like the podcast, go and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. And of course, please tell all your friends about it. It's always nice to, every week as it goes on, see that there's a bit of a growth in the followers and the subscribers. And then lastly, as always, nothing in this podcast was intended to be tax advice or a substitute for fact-specific tax advice. Until next time, goodbye.